Welcome, and thank you for joining this Port of Los Angeles media briefing. I'm Philip Sanfield, the Port's media director. With me here at the Port's administrative offices is Jean Seroka, the executive director of the Port of Los Angeles. Welcome, Jean.
Hello, Philip, and good morning from Los Angeles. I'm so pleased to be here with all of you today and have an especially important and informative session ahead. In just a moment, we'll have the honor and privilege of being joined from Washington, D.C. by United States Department of Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Before we welcome the Secretary, I'm going to very briefly touch on our October cargo volume. Our numbers will be available soon, and we'll distribute a news release sharing all key data on imports, exports, and empties. Total volume for the month of October will come in at about 900,000 TEUs, yet another strong month here in Los Angeles. It's a decline of about 8% compared to last October, which was our busiest month in the year 2020. As you know, we need more maneuverability on our marine terminals to process this ever-surging cargo. Clearing our docks of imports and empties have been a priority of ours in recent weeks. The good news is that we've seen significant improvement over these past several weeks. Since October 24th, we've seen a 25% drop from about 95,000 containers to 71,000 in the number of import containers on our docks. And cargo sitting 9 days or longer has dropped by 29%. There's much more work to be done on this front, but great progress by our dock workers, shipping lines, truckers, marine terminal operators, and railroad partners. 10 months into year 2021, we're tracking 15% ahead of last year. We're estimating to finish 2021 handling about 10.8 million TEUs, far more cargo than any other port in the Western Hemisphere has ever handled, and improving on our previous best record of about 9.5 million TEUs in 2018 by about 14%. Despite the surge of consumer demand that has triggered a strain on the global supply chain, it's important to remember that we continue to deliver record amounts of cargo. Fortunately, we have leadership in Washington, D.C. who has made supply chain disruption a national priority. And that leads us to our special guest, Secretary Buttigieg. On July 15th, the Secretary convened a joint port supply chain solutions roundtable. Since then, we've been collaborating day and night with the DOT and our stakeholders to identify priority issues and develop solutions. Mr. Secretary, welcome on behalf of ports around the country, and thank you for all your efforts. Congratulations on the signing of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act.
Well, thanks very much, Gene, for your partnership. And I want to thank everyone who is involved at the Port of LA and across our supply chains, the workers who have done such tremendous work in such demanding times. And thanks to everybody who's joining us right now. It's a great week to be talking about these things. Many weeks have been named Infrastructure Week over the last few decades, but this is the first Infrastructure Week to begin with a president signing a historic infrastructure bill of this magnitude. And we're eager to get to work. Let me offer a few broad comments on supply chains, and then we can zoom in specifically on the Port of LA. As so many of us know, decades of underinvestment in our supply chain infrastructure, combined with unprecedented consumer demand, and you may have seen today's retail numbers, the highest dollar figure ever recorded for retail sales, and of course, a global pandemic, all combining to put our supply chains to the test. Now, the Biden-Harris administration has been focused on this throughout. As Gene mentioned, we had that convening in July and so many actions coming out of that. We recognize that while supply chains are mainly private sector, and rightly so in America, there are moves that the administration can and must take to help. And these were reflected when the president laid out his port action plan at the Port of Baltimore last week. A few high points that illustrate what we're doing around the country. Working with the Georgia Ports Authority to provide flexibility for federal funds to create pop-up container yards in Georgia and North Carolina to transfer containers via rail and truck further inland, freeing up the dock space that is so precious over on the port side itself. Within the next 45 days, we're going to announce $230 million of funding from around the country from the existing Port Infrastructure Development Grant Program. And then within 90 days, we'll be opening up the next round of PIDP, which will be the first funded under the new bipartisan infrastructure law. Meanwhile, with 70% of our goods moving by truck, DOT is supporting our state partners in cutting red tape to make it easier to attain those CDLs that are so important. But let's also acknowledge that to truly address driver shortages, we're going to make truck driving a more attractive and more well-paid profession. So we've been engaging the trucking industry since the summer to highlight practices we think could reduce those very high turnover levels that we're seeing. Things like paying drivers for all of the time that they're away from home, providing better access to facilities, and trucks that are equipped with the latest safety technology. Also, earlier this month, our department announced a partnership with the state of California to develop and finance a set of major infrastructure projects that strengthen our supply chains throughout critical trade corridors. So these are all steps that are going to help improve the flow of goods to Americans and lay the groundwork for the structural changes we need. That's where the bipartisan infrastructure law that the president just signed comes in. A once-in-a-generation set of investments, including $17 billion to improve infrastructure in our ports and our waterways. It's the biggest federal investment in ports in U.S. history. And it includes provisions for electrification so that we can have more throughput without an associated increase in pollution. We are rapidly working to unlock the potential of this deal with 45-day, 60-day, and 90-day deliverables per the president's plan, as well as the resources to improve roads and bridges that we know are such a big part of the puzzle here, and billions of dollars into our programs to improve freight rail and the handoffs between all of the different funds. So I just wanted to offer that big picture as we focus now back in on the Port of LA. As Gene mentioned, in July, we came together with port leadership, freight rail retailers, shippers, labor unions, everybody who could play a role here. And with the leadership of our port envoy, John Porcari, we've been able to make a lot of progress. Last month, the ports of LA and Long Beach and the International Longshore and Warehouse Union Workers, ILWU, joined together with that commitment for 24/7 ops to boost throughput and efficiency. And we've seen a lot of the country's largest companies jump in as well and step up with commitments to move more containers during off-peak hours. Both of the major railroads responsible for moving goods out of the ports, BNSF and Union Pacific, they've announced discounts to customers on each container moved by rail during the weekend. And Union Pacific has stepped up to operate its station near the ports 24/7. Our envoy, John Porcari, has been leading 3 times a week meetings with stakeholders to really get in tactically and identify operational problems and immediate solutions, and successfully working with ocean shippers to send ships into the ports to pick up empty dwelling containers to make more room for cargo. And we've supported the port's recent actions to charge ocean carriers for allowing containers to linger on marine terminals where that can get in the way. So we're encouraged by these positive signs like what Gene has shared, seeing the number of containers dwelling for at least 9 days reduced. That is an early but a very promising sign. And let me just end with a point that, at risk of stating the obvious, is so important to remember. The single surest way to end pandemic-related disruptions is to end the pandemic. And that's why the vaccine push of this administration is another tool in our toolkit to move goods efficiently across the U.S. So with that, let me turn it back over to Jim.
Thank you, Secretary. Let's start with just a few topics before we take questions from the media. And many of us watched last week as President Biden announced the action plan for America's ports and waterways. It's designed to connect the dots between now and the future. Could you walk us through your vision of how we plan to address issues today as well as in the long term?
Yeah, thanks. I think connecting the dots is a great way to push it. We're trying to be as creative as we can in order to facilitate, support, and where appropriate, drive the kinds of steps that are going to help goods move more efficiently, like that idea of the pop-up inland ports or container yards that we were talking about. New flexibility with grant funding so that ports that already have really important and creative ideas can go forward and execute. And that time clock that the president's put us on, I think, is really going to drive action. I mean, to have as little time as we're going to pass between announcing this current round of PIDP funding and preparing the notice to go out for the next round, it shows the sense of urgency that we have wanting to bridge what we've done so far with, what's next. The other thing I want to mention is the increasing need for us to be really smart with data and technology. I've seen a lot of the players in our U.S. ports leading the way. I want to continue to see more of that because there are so many things we do to better use the resources we already have if we can get the data flowing the right ways.
That's great, and we agree with you. Mr. Secretary, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act encompasses so many aspects of our economy and supply chain beyond ports. There's funding for electric vehicles, charging stations, grid resiliency, so important here in California, as well as workforce development. How is the administration coordinating all the different agencies and components to maximize the impact?
Well, this was a big theme at the cabinet meeting that the president gathered us for on Friday. You know, we've got to work across the traditional silos of the federal org chart, and that's exactly what we're committing to do in delivering on this historic legislation. This is fundamentally a jobs bill. That's how the president views it. That's how we've been talking about it, because we're going to need so many construction workers, electrical workers, pipe fitters, just in order to create and support the infrastructure improvements that we're driving. Also represent a lot of investments improvements for climate and equity. We've seen a climate title like we have in this kind of legislation. When we're doing things like investing in healthy ports, that benefits the communities that live near ports. It's got a lot of climate benefits. Even things like electrification really ripple through all of the priorities we've laid out: safety, economic growth, climate equity, to make sure that we're truly building on that 21st century infrastructure that we need. And I'll tell you, the discretionary grant programs that have been either augmented or created, they're going to include criteria that really reflect the priorities that this administration has. This is not about building back to what we used to have. This is, as the president always says, building back better. And we're going to work to make sure we maximize every one of those federal dollars, because even though the dollar numbers are huge, the impact is only huge if we make the absolute most of those precious taxpayer resources. And that's a responsibility as well as an opportunity that we're taking very seriously in my agency and across the government.
No, that's right. And with the cargo that traverses the Port of Los Angeles reaching each and every one of our nation's 435 congressional districts, we believe the best return on investment for the American people is right here in Los Angeles. As you know, Mr. Secretary, containerized U.S. exports have declined significantly over the past 3 years. How will the Infrastructure and Jobs Investment Act assist American exporters, particularly manufacturers and those in the agricultural sector?
So we've been meeting with agricultural stakeholders regularly, and it is very important that we make sure that the system works in both directions. Part of what we've got to do is improve our infrastructure across major trade corridors. And a lot of that is inland, even if we see it most acutely reflected in some of the issues that hit the coasts and the ports. The DOT is going to publish a playbook for states on how best to use the grant and loan programs that we either are growing or are creating to support goods movement. States are going to receive more than $50 billion a year in federal aid highway funding now, which can be used in a lot of ways, including the improved performance of these corridors. So the new state level plan is going to include a look at supply chain cargo flows, inventories of commercial ports, the estimates of the impacts of e-commerce on freight infrastructure that really has changed the game much more quickly than some of our infrastructure can keep up. Things like assessments of truck parking facilities and other points that we hear a lot about as we engage stakeholders. Not to make sure that we are being smart to tune our existing resources and build our new ones to support those exports, especially but not only in agriculture, that are such an important part of the American economy.
Thank you, Secretary Buttigieg. I know that you've agreed to stay with us for a few minutes so we can take some questions to the media, and I think Philip's got a couple of those topped up right now.
Thank you, Gene. Our first question is for the Secretary, and it comes from Jeff Berman from Logistics Management. Mr. Secretary, with respect to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, how much of an issue is the U.S. labor shortage in getting projects up and running to help work through the ongoing supply chain challenges?
Well, one thing I appreciate about this bipartisan bill is it doesn't just create jobs, although we're very enthusiastic about the job creation for the long run. And by the way, accessible jobs, most of them don't require a college degree. but we're also directly looking at what we can do to improve the labor force readiness and workforce in this country. For example, for truckers, the bill sets up an apprenticeship program that we think is a way to encourage more 18 to 21-year-olds to come into the field without having to compromise on safety, using that mentorship and apprenticeship approach to more safely bring people into the field. Now, let me also point to the second part of the president's economic agenda, Build Back Better, which includes ways to tear down some of the barriers that are keeping people who are ready and willing to work out of the labor force. And one of the biggest, of course, is the availability and affordability of childcare. So taken together, there's a reason why the economists so often say that the president's overall vision will ease inflationary pressures, including some of those pressures you see in labor markets. But we're also, again, very excited and proud about the things just contained in that first part, the infrastructure portion that the president signed yesterday.
Thank you. A question from Jeff Berman for Gene Seroka. What port-related aspects of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act do you view as most critical in helping ports to work through the current backlog and congestion issues?
Thanks for joining again today, Jeff. A whole host of ideas that come out of this act. Number one is it allows us to accelerate the projects that we have shovel ready on the ground here at the Port of Los Angeles. And they amount to about $500 million of new build opportunities right here, whether they be rail and road connectors, densifying the on-dock rail, fortifying and expanding the use of land here, and activating that property, as we've seen, so vital to managing this surge of import cargo and being able to triangulate the opportunities for empty returns, chassis movement, and the pickup of imports to go out the gates. So we're ready to go, and this opportunity now just gets us moving that much faster.
Very good. Thank you, Gene. The next question is directed at the Secretary from Lisa Bartline at Reuters. Has the administration discovered any low-hanging fruit, projects that are easy to implement to speed up cargo movement through LA and Long Beach?
Yeah, even as we look to the long term, and by the way, what Gene just said reminds me of what I hear from port directors, also mayors, governors, and other leaders across the country. They already have a list an arm's length long of things they would love to do, have put together a vision for, and now we're going to have more funding to help. But when it comes to this question, look, the challenge here is we're talking about global interconnected supply chains, mostly run by the private sector, and finding ways that we can support improvements from our role as the administration. And that's where I've been really impressed by the creativity that's gone into some of the solutions that have been proposed. Obviously, the step toward 24/7 is really big. The idea of the sweeper ships going around, picking up the empties, the action, regular kind of battle rhythm of action meetings to identify tactical issues on the ground, partnering with workers, with labor to make sure that we have the labor that we need. I want to applaud and recognize Gene for taking that action to propose fees on lingering containers that are getting in the way. And we're going to continue looking for those kinds of creative ideas. I heard somebody say this is not a silver bullet situation. It's more silver buckshot, a lot of different things that can be deployed at the same time. And if we're smart about it, while there's no easy fix to these issues, because again, we're talking about everything from global imbalances in supply and demand to the holes that are poked in all of our logistical systems by the pandemic, we do see results, and we do see opportunity to get more results as we go.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. You mentioned 24/7 operations. Paul Berger from the Wall Street Journal has a question for you, and then perhaps Gene can follow up. President Biden last month said the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach would move to 24/7 operations. Why hasn't it happened yet? And what can the administration do to help marine terminals and truckers shift to 24/7?
Well, I know Gene will have a lot of insights from on the ground on this, but let me point to a couple of things. First of all, let's recognize it's, of course, not flipping a switch. There are so many players, even just on the grounds of the port. And what we know is that opening of the gate, so to speak, necessary but not sufficient, right? It's that first step. And then we've been working with some of the other players across the supply chain, including the rail operators. But I'll tell you the key moment really was the leadership of the ports of LA and Long Beach being ready to do that. And we're really excited to see more movement in that direction. But Gene, let me turn it to you because I know you can offer more insights from all of the different moving pieces on the ground.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary. What we've been doing over time is working about 19 hours a day. And then as the cargo began to surge, we implemented flex hours, opening the gates a little bit earlier, staggering lunches, working a little bit later in between the day and night side shifts. While offering the 24/7 capability here at the port, it's an effort to try to get this entire orchestra of supply chain players to get on the same calendar. We've had very few takers to date, but there are some hurdles that we have to overcome. The warehousing complex, of which we boast 2 billion square feet from the shores of the Pacific out to the desert region in Southern California, traditionally worked during the day, and they found it difficult to bring in workers during this time. We've got to get these folks expanding their hours, making these opportunities for jobs, which are good paying now, between $19 and $25 an hour, a reality. There are about 400,000 warehouse jobs open throughout the country right now, and about 8,000 just in our small area here in Southern California. On the trucking side, as we've explained before, Paul, drivers have a limit federally mandated of 11 hours behind the wheel every day. And if they work consecutively, they must take a rest. We need to find a way to create a profession once again in the truck driving community to attract, recruit, and retain folks who want this as a job and a career. We need to add more drivers. The American Truckers Association has said we're short about 80,000 drivers right now, but we have numerous folks with commercial driver's licenses. And there was some research done in publications earlier this week about the fact that folks are leaving this industry to work in other sectors or other segments of our economy. We need to bring them back in. There's no shortage of folks who have the credentials. We got to get them back into this port drayage system and give them the service that they need. They're paid by the turn traditionally. So let's get in and out of the port swiftly so they can deliver the goods. These are our first and last mile ambassadors, and we have to treat them as such. I think once we catch our breath, we're going to have to figure out a way to look differently at compensation and benefits in order to accelerate what we want to do to create these professional jobs. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. The next question is for the secretary. It's from Stas Margaronis from the American Journal of Transportation. In 2007, President Bush's maritime administrator promoted the marine highway concept to move containers by waterborne transportation using coastal ships, tugs, and barges to reduce road congestion. Yet few marine highway services exist today. Would you support increased funding for marine highway shipping to deliver more port cargo via water?
Yeah, not only do we support it, we're doing it thanks to this legislation. You know, this marine highway program is something I'm looking forward to communicating with the public more about, because I don't think it's very well understood. But if you think about the benefits from a congestion perspective, from a pollution perspective, of moving more cargo onto the waterways that are around our country, including inland, the potential is huge. So in the next 45 days, as per the Biden-Harris action plan, we'll be announcing the awards for the next round of grants, which will be about $13 million. And the infrastructure deal provides $25 million looking forward, which is a significant increase. We pulled the numbers on the recent years, and I think if you start the clock in fiscal 2010 through 2021, about $50 million has been appropriated for the program. So we're excited to take things to the next level, because we do think that the potential of our waterways to get freight off of roads and to reduce emissions, it's underutilized, and we should be doing more and will be.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We have two more questions for you. The next one is from Eric Watkins of Lloyd's List. He asks, the infrastructure package allocates $17 billion for ports and inland waterways. The American Association of Port Authorities told Congress in May that ports alone need more than $75 billion. Are there plans to develop additional funding for ports?
Well, again, we're delivering a historic level of funding in order to improve and support ports around the country. But we need to find more resources across the country. It can't all be from federal grants, even if we're about to see more in federal grants than has proven possible in the U.S. We're going to have to keep working with local and state and private partners in order to make sure that we have the kinds of resources that are needed. I would also point to our emerging projects agreement with California, which I think helps unlock some of the financing that is needed in order to do more. So in addition to the largest infrastructure bill in our country's history and what that means, we're going to continue looking for ways to unlock value. And then, of course, just as importantly, make sure that those dollars are used as efficiently as possible and get that multiplier effect when we actually deliver.
Thank you. This last question for you, Mr. Secretary, comes from Bill Mongaluzzo of the Journal of Commerce. The federal government's approach in the past toward the funding of port-related infrastructure seemed to be that many projects got some money, but most did not get enough money as the government attempted to spread the grants around to a number of ports, both large and small. Given the major congestion issues that the largest gateways are experiencing, do you see wisdom in directing larger sums of money toward infrastructure projects in fewer ports?
Well, I think we got to look at the merits of every grant application that comes in, but I will say that that need to spread things around with limited resources is largely a function of not having the pot be big enough to do all of the things that you want to. I mean, that's true in all of our discretionary programs where we work with the project's sponsors, often very effectively, to say, hey, if there's going to have to be a haircut on this grant, can you still deliver the intended results, and how can we help guide you toward that? But of course, the bigger the pot, the less you have to turn to those measures. And that's one of the reasons why we think that this transformational investment that is so historic in its proportions also means that we can fund those transformative projects of national significance. You know, when you talk about how much we depend on one region, whether it's the Gateway program for rail in New York, New Jersey, where, you know, if those tunnels became unavailable and they're 110 years old, you would feel the economic impact thousands of miles inland. Or whether we're talking about LA and Long Beach, which is one specific region where 40% of our containerized traffic is coming through, which obviously means it's a matter of national significance too. So yes, we want to make sure we have adequate funding to support big projects at big ports, but we're not going to neglect smaller operations, rural communities, places where sometimes you get that much more bang for the federal dollar, precisely because they've been so under-resourced in the past. And we're going to continue working across the supply chain, across the country, and looking for those great grant ideas that give us the absolute most bang for the buck.
United States Department of Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Mr. Secretary, I know that you have to go. Thanks for joining us today. The leadership and work of the administration is critical to our nation's future. We look forward to continuing our partnership with you and all the hard work ahead.
Well, thank you. Likewise, really appreciate your leadership and your partnership and the attention of everybody who has been helping educate the country about these issues, as they have suddenly, deservedly gotten the attention that they really ought to.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Okay, thank you. We have a few more questions that have come in, and Jean is going to, these will be addressed to Jean. Wanted to go back to one from Stas Margaronis that we didn't have time for, directed at Jean. You've said, Jean, that you've been working with ocean carriers to increase the deployment of sweeper ships to reduce the backlog of empty containers. Can you update us on how many sweeper ships have or will be arriving at the port?
Yeah, great question, Stas. And to set this up, let me put a couple of numbers at you. First, we average about 350,000 empty container units that get repoed back to Asia every month from the Port of Los Angeles. It's about 90,000 a week, and we're up about 30% compared to that repo number just last year, when we really started to peak with the import surge. We're also receiving empty containers from non-traditional geographies right now by rail. Think of the South Atlantic and Gulf Coast areas. So we've got to double our efforts to get these empties out and back to Asia to pre-position those assets for the next round of imports. But this is where it becomes a math problem. As I reported to you, we did 900,000 TEUs for the month of October, and that's the 15th consecutive month averaging what used to be 1 month in our peak season. The longshore men and women have been out on the job an average of 6 days per week since the pandemic began and continue to welcome record numbers of vessels every week for work. We're averaging 15 over the last 12 months. And over the last 6 weeks, we've been averaging about 17 container ships working import compared to the same time last year. Now, with these empties, we've got to get the cargo off the docks. And that's been part of the program so far, which we've witnessed over the last 3 weeks, has depleted the number of containers aging on our docks by 29%. That gives us a little more room on the terminal tarmac to bring in empties and exports, but they have to be loaded against the vessels. We cannot let those empty containers dwell for long periods either. We've got to increase velocity while being in a healthy and safe environment for our workforce, but not letting those containers sit at rest for long. Those dwell times continue to be high, and we're encouraging all of our liner shipping companies to bring these empties through, even the ones that have been decked or grounded at near dock facilities that the port has opened up in recent weeks. And therefore, if we can pull this off by expediting the imports out gate on rail and truck, bring those empties in at nighttime and work them against the vessel, we can do a lot better. Specifically on your question of extra vessels or sweepers, encouraging, but there's still plenty of work to do. We've seen 6 additional sweeper ships so far pick up a little more than 17,500 TEUs of empties, and there are another 2 on their way that can pick up probably 2,500 more empty container units. We've got to do a lot more than that. We've got about 65,000 empty container units sitting on the docks right now. That's up from 55,000 just a couple of Fridays ago. But we did have a good weekend. So the propensity is there for us to keep loading against the ships, getting these empties out so we have more room to speed our imports to market. Thanks, Stas.
Thank you, Gene. Question has come in from Michael Sasso. I believe he's with Bloomberg. Can you expound on your comment earlier about very few takers regarding 24/7 operations? Is that regarding truckers, warehouses to commit to the 24/7 concept?
It's about the importers. They've got to be able to shift their service providers to work on the same calendar as the port. We need commitments. Early on, I talked about Accelerate Cargo Los Angeles. This was turning our truck outgates to a push system. We understand whose cargo is on the docks, where it's located, and how long it's been there. And we need to push that cargo out to make room for the vessels that are at anchor and those that are on the way across the Pacific. There are more than 125,000 importing companies that call Los Angeles home every year for their goods. So far, with Accelerate Cargo LA, 21 companies have taken us up on this offer. And while it's a manual process today, it will be digitized, and we can push this cargo out much quicker than simply waiting for truck owners to come and pick up the boxes. Right now, we've got at least 30% of our truck gates that go unused every day for a variety of reasons. So thanks to the efforts of Port Envoy John Pacari, we're opening up all the gates to return empties, make sure that we have the ability to do dual transactions, and if not, we're decking those empties at near dock facilities so we can bring the chassis and the truck over to the marine terminal, check for roadability, and then get off with their import container. We've got to keep this velocity going. It's so very important. Appreciate the question. Thank you.
Got 1 or 2 questions here. If we may be able to get to another 1 or 2. So if anyone wants to drop one into the chat box now at the bottom of your screen, we'll try to get to it. Mediha DiMartino from the the Los Angeles Business Journal asks if we are close to the end of the holiday season.
Hi, Medea. Thanks for joining. I would say yes. We'll probably see a leveling off following the Thanksgiving holiday, but not a big drop in imports because we do have an early Lunar New Year scheduled for the first week of February. And then most retailers are telling me directly that they'll focus on inventory replenishment during our traditional slack season or Q2 next year. Now, just reported on CNBC this morning was that inventories came in at 0.7% up, beating the estimates and showing that we're starting to replenish now. which is good news. But there's a lot more work to do to make sure that there are inventories on the ground through our omni-channel distribution network and having the product on store shelves and in fulfillment centers. We heard from the National Retail Federation 1.7% growth in October compared to September, and 16.3% growth for the retail community year over year in October. Inventory is there, and I've shared on this press call and others before that our savvy retail community pulled forward a lot of their inventory and imports this year. We started seeing Christmas and holiday goods cross the docks in June, much earlier than traditionally seen in late August and early September. So I think inventories are starting to build, which is good. Choices will be wider for us, the American consumer, but we still have a lot of strength in the import market. And we're seeing that through the Horizon, the Port Optimizer, and the Signal, other tools we use to look forward and see how that cargo flow is so we can make sure that we have the right staffing and machinery on the ground to move the product. Thanks, Medea.
Gene, kind of a follow-up to that holiday season question comes from Steve Overly at Politico. He notes that there are 84 container ships waiting to get into LA Long Beach as of this morning. How many of those ships can realistically get unloaded in the next month based on current delays?
Well, we're averaging, Steve, about 17 ships working per day here. And really trying to use the permutations and do the math on this is very interesting because only about 1/3 of these ships that are at anchor right now are the traditional trans-Pacific vessels in the normal rotation. That would be of 10,000 TEU variety and larger. The balance, 2/3 of these ships are much smaller vessels, averaging 5,000 TEUs or less, and they represent newcomers to the trade, those inter-Asia and long-haul cargo services that shifted their vessel assets to take advantage of this trans-Pacific growth. We've also seen several retailers and other importers here in the U.S. charter vessels for the first time and bring their cargo in through alternative means. And then you've got others who have joined from the traditional carrier side, augmenting their own capacity with smaller ships that they pulled from different trades. Now, some of the newcomers and the chartered ships loaded up containers, started their way across the Pacific without reservations to dock here at the Port of Los Angeles. And that's a lot of what you're seeing with those 2/3 of ships at anchor represented by the smaller ships. And realistically, at our market leading 11,000 container units loaded and unloaded per average vessel that comes into Los Angeles, that 84 container ship number at anchor is actually much smaller if we look at it from a traditional ship size. But we're going to keep chipping away. Getting this aging cargo off the docks is job number one. Working the empties to vessel is a parallel effort to make sure that we can loosen up those terminal tarmacs and start bringing these anchored ships in. Again, with a 29% reduction on that older cargo moving off the docks, while 3 weeks worth of ships have come in and returned back to Asia, is a good sign that we'll start moving at those anchored ships pretty quickly.
Gene, we've got a couple of questions that have come in about the dwell fee program. Can you explain the thought process that went into the decision to delay any fees until at the earliest next Monday?
No, I'm happy to discuss that, Philip. And as Secretary Buttigieg said, we tried just about everything, starting with his roundtable in the summertime on July 15th, bringing all industry stakeholders together to get after root causes and problems with the supply chain, which we know are global, but most importantly, to focus right here at home in the United States. We've tried diplomacy, collaboration, 3 times weekly meetings with the White House and Port Envoy John Picari, and we simply could not move the needle. And therefore, on October 24th, as we were looking at our numbers and trying to segment cargo, I came to the painful decision of having to implement a penalty. This was a last-ditch effort to get people's attention. And this was not to publicly shame anyone, but we saw on the ground there was cargo that simply wasn't needed right now, while there were others who needed to get their cargo to market fast for the holidays. And please remember that 20% of our imports are cargo going to our manufacturing facilities nationwide. These are parts, components, and peripherals that are needed on our factory floors right now. And therefore, when we announced this penalty on October 25th, we took a baseline approach of all the imports on our docks and all the imports that were aging 9 days or longer scheduled to move out by truck, and those that were 6 days and longer scheduled to move out by train. And after 3 weeks, while working a record number of ships by our great ILW men and women, we've reduced that by 29% on the aging cargo side. And all imports are down about 25%. Here again, giving our marine terminal operators more maneuverability so they can get trucks in and out, start loading trains and pushing them out at record pace as well. The Western railroads have excess capacity right now. Their bookings have been down. We've got to pump those up as well because we've got rail capacity to get cargo out to market. And again, while we may be coming to the waning days and weeks of our traditional holiday season, we're still going to be bringing in cargo ahead of the early Lunar New Year and then working on inventory replenishment nationwide. So all of these moves so far have been so very important. And here again, what I announced yesterday in concert with Executive Director at the Port of Long Beach, Mario Cordero, and Port Envoy John Picari, is that we saw enough progress over the last 3 weeks that we delayed the implementation of this penalty by at least a week. So we're going to see how the cargo movement takes place over the next 6 days, leading up to Monday, the 22nd of November. We've also given an additional task to the liner shipping companies and marine terminal operators to double down on loading back empties against vessels to get them back to Asia, not at the expense of the American exporter. And that's why we've asked for more ships to come in and pick up and overload on those empties going back to Asia. But we'll continue to monitor this. I'm encouraged by the traction we're receiving, but we still have a long way to go to get these older containers off the docks. And again, if nothing else, let's segment them to the side for right now and get the cargo to market that needs to be there immediately. Thanks for the question.
Gene, let's try to squeeze 2 quick questions in here before any final thoughts of yours. First one's from Edwin Lopez at Supply Chain Dive. How many terminals have agreed to operate 24/7 in Los Angeles, provided they get the off-peak hour appointments?
Thanks for joining, Edwin. And I'm so proud of our Los Angeles marine terminal operators, the Pacific Maritime Association led by Jim McKenna, and the International Longshore and Warehouse Union led by International President Willie Adams. And of course, our local presidents here that drive all of our business, Ramon Ponce de Leon of Local 13, Danny Miranda of Local 94, and Local 63 President Mike Perdue of the Marine Clerks. Everybody is rallied around this subject to say we're open and we're ready for business. As I mentioned to an earlier question, we've been running at about 19 hours a day regularly and then focused on flex shifts, meaning instead of a traditional opening on the day side at 8 o'clock, we've opened truck gates at 7 o'clock in the morning and earlier to welcome folks who want to get in and out before rush hour. We've staggered lunches and we've tried to stagger the close of day side before the opening of the night side shift. But realistically speaking, we haven't had many takers yet. There have been stories out in the media already of terminals that have been pre-positioning imports on chassis wheels ready to go, and they've had no pickups. We've got to get these calendars synced up. Again, it's going to take some hiring in the truck side and the warehouse side as well, and resetting schedules from our import community. And that's why we've been working on this push system. And if nothing else, we're going to be using these off-peak hours to shuttle the empty containers that we've grounded or decked at near dock facilities back to the terminals so they can work against the ships. We're going to try to squeeze every hour, every shift worth of efficiency that we can out of the port complex. It'll take time, we understand that, but there are pockets of opportunity here for us really to raise the bar. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Gene. Last question back from Stephen Overley at Politico again. What requests are you making now to the Biden administration to address the port backlogs?
Well, we've been working so closely since Inauguration Day and before. Our own Naveen Sharma has many contacts in the administration today that he worked with during the Obama-Biden administration that really leveraged those partnerships so we can get on the ground and start creatively thinking. It was back in February that the president issued the executive order on supply chain. In June, he constructed the Supply Chain Disruption Task Force led by the secretaries of Labor, Commerce and Secretary Buttigieg from the Transportation Department. So all of this started coming together leading up to the Secretary's roundtable meeting in the middle of July. So what we're asking for is all types of work around supply chain efficiencies. We think squeezing this out through digitization is really key. The data insights that I provide you and the confidence that I share our information comes from the Port Optimizer, the nation's first and still only port community system. While designed initially to help with operations, decision, and exception management purposes, and while opening up transparency and visibility, it's also allowed us to really look deeper into the data to understand where bottlenecks may be taking place, where trends are happening, how we can take advantage of them, or corrective action, no matter what the case may be. So all of this work will continue. And now with those shovel-ready projects lists that I shared earlier, we're ready to get in front of the appropriators and others to make sure that we get our fair share. As I've told this audience before, over the last decade, the federal government and U.S. Congress has outinvested the West Coast at a rate of 11-1. That's $11 billion that's been designated for spending on the East and Gulf Coast ports, compared to a little more than $1 billion here at West Coast ports. 40% of the nation's imports come through the Southern California Gateway. We manage 30% of our country's exports. This is where the investment needs to be made. Appreciate the interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gene. And that concludes our time for questions. Back to you for any final thoughts.
Thanks, Philip. Before we sign off, I'd like to call everyone's attention to the ever-increasing data available on the cargo operations dashboard, right at the top of our hero slide of the Port of Los Angeles website homepage. This dashboard provides a snapshot, updated daily and in real time in most cases, using a variety of sources, including the Port Optimizer data from Wabtec. Since the start of the pandemic, we've posted daily updates about vessel sailing cancellations to the number of ships in port. Once anchorage started and became a trend, we populated that information and expanded to include ships at anchor and wait times. Estimated import volumes and gate hours with live cameras are also on the dashboard now as well. New data is added to the dashboard as it becomes available. Our daily operations report, designed by Mike DiBernardo, offers an overall snapshot of the day, both on the docks and out in the San Pedro Bay. While our import container dwell report that Eric Harris has designed along with Aveen, David Libatique, and others shows how containers are beginning to move off terminals. From quick updates to a deeper dive into analytics, with one dashboard, we offer a wealth of data as all service of the Port of Los Angeles. You can view the cargo operations dashboard at the portoflosangeles.org/dashboard. Thank you, everyone, for your interest and participation today. Until next